I'm making a calm open world exploration game and I feel like it's time for some quests. I'd also like to add some small creatures. So there are a few things I wanted from this quest system. First of all, I wanted it to support different kinds of responses when an NPC is interacted with. For example, a simple fixed answer or an answer that depends on whether you've done something or collected something. Second, I wanted it to support minigames, with a high score system and built in a way that I can make new minigames without having to change the base quest code. And finally, I of course wanted these quests to be saved in the player log and be trackable. First thing I did was create a model for these higher life forms that the player can talk to. For this, I again used the metahuman model as a base mesh, so I don't have to spend a bunch of time getting the proportions right. I did some sculpting, which of course messed up the geometry flow of the metahuman mesh, so I fixed the parts that got messed up, like the head and elbows. Then I went into Substance Painter and made the material. When that was done, I exported it to Unreal Engine and did some material coding to add some simple customization options, like the color of the skin and eyes. I'll also be making a few simple clothes for these aliens, but that's not a priority right now. So the first thing I did was create a system for what to do when the player hasn't interacted with them. They can of course just stand or sit still, but they can also follow a path that I've marked with a spline. Then I made it so this can change depending on which step of the quest you're on. So the player can have a conversation, and when it's time for the next step of the quest, the alien goes somewhere else. I also added two methods of changing between these two locations. The alien can either walk to its new location, or it can teleport there when the player isn't looking. This second option is useful for large distances or going from one island to another. When that was finished, I started working on a conversation system. I don't have the money, equipment or time to animate all the face movements for an actual conversation, so instead I made a bunch of different eye and mouth expressions the character can switch between throughout the conversation. Then I used a kind of growl sound effect and made the mouth open in sync with that. Later on, I also realized that different people read at very different paces, so I changed it from a fixed duration text to be skippable by pressing space. As I said, this system is also made to be expandable, so the player can have different responses depending on any parameters I want. The player of course has to have an overview of available quests and be able to track them for convenience. So that's what I made next. This was pretty complex, but I'm going to skip over it because it's just a bunch of boring programming. Finally, as I said, I want to make minigames. The first minigame I'll make in this video is a game where you need to hit all targets as fast as possible. I then also added a timer at the top of the screen, along with the scores needed to get 1, 2 or 3 stars. This score of course gets saved, but I also made the alien respond differently depending on your score. There were of course some issues. I also decided to add a system for swinging targets for some extra challenge. After some testing, I realized it's pretty annoying trying to aim when you can only throw rocks. Since different objects can also be thrown more or less far, this makes it even more annoying learning to aim. So I created a projectile path visualizer. I was researching the best way of doing this and found out Unreal Engine has a function for this built in, which predicts the path of a thrown object for a certain duration and does traces to detect hits. I did some coding to convert these points to a usable spline mesh, for which I then made a simple material. This is what I ended up with. This is already a much more enjoyable minigame. Alright, with the quest and minigame system finished, it's time for even more creatures. I have a bunch of big creatures with really complex behavior, but due to their complex behavior and detail, 50 is about the maximum number of them I can spawn at any time. Which of course isn't enough if you want small creatures in numbers, like insects, small birds and many other things. I quickly realized the best way of doing this would be with complex particle systems and material displacement animations. Since both the particle system and materials are calculated on GPU, the performance should be really great with this method. There's just one big problem. I still want the player to be able to photograph these smaller creatures and study them, but to do this, the normal blueprints, calculated on the CPU, need to have access to the locations of all these creatures, which they currently don't have since, as I said, this particle system is calculated on the GPU. Luckily, I found out about a Niagara module that saved my idea: export particle data to blueprints. This allows me to send some information on all the particles, like most importantly their locations, to the other code. There was still one problem. It doesn't send this data in a synchronized fashion, and it can't send updates when a particle gets destroyed. The best way I found of fixing this was to add the time at which the update happened to each array entry, and use this to remove every update older than 0.2 seconds, which is the rate at which the particle updates are sent. For optimization, I also made the particle system only send updates when relatively nearby. That's the biggest obstacle crossed, but I also made a bunch more custom modules and dynamic input scripts to walk on surfaces, custom spawning and movement modules, and much more. I also learned this technique for behavior states and particle systems from Ghislain Girardot, who is probably the most talented technical artist on YouTube. I'll put a link to his video in the description. Alright, I forgot to talk about the vertex displacement animations. For this, I just made some masks for the legs and body with some gradients down the length of all the legs. Then, using this information, I can use math to animate this. No rigging or weight painting required. Of course, this won't work for complex animations, but walking, flying or swimming cycles are no problem. I also use the particle color to output the speed at which the particle is moving and use this to make it move more or less. Finally, I made a big quality of life improvement. How the camera used to work is that it does a ray trace straight forward, and whatever that hits, the player is looking at. I completely rewrote all of that code. So now there's an array with all the creatures and creature particles in the world. It then removes all creatures that are out of the camera view and gives the remaining creatures a relevancy value based on their distance to the player and distance to the middle of the screen. Finally, it finds the creature with the highest relevancy and does a line trace to detect any obstacles between the creature and the player. If there are none, that creature is selected. If there are, it moves on to the next highest relevancy creature and so forth. This system is much better and, for example, allows for use of the rule of thirds. I hope you liked the video. If the game interests you, consider following the Kickstarter, where you'll be able to get the game at a discount and early access. You can also join the Discord or subscribe. Bye.